I was bent over my notebook, pencil scratching in jagged lines, pretending to be absorbed in homework I didn't really care about. The hum of the fluorescent lights above the repair shop mingled with the occasional clink of tools and the low thrum of old machinery. I had perfected the illusion of busyness, head down, shoulders tight, eyes darting only at the pages in front of me. And then she was there. She didn't announce herself. She just slid onto the stool next to mine like she belonged there, and I realized I'd been holding my breath without noticing. Mid-40s, maybe, with that effortless composure that made it clear she didn't need anyone to take her seriously, because she already commanded it. Her hair was streaked with silver, not in a desperate look older way, but like it had been collected through years she'd actually lived. Her eyes, hazel, a little too sharp for the casual glance, met mine immediately, and I froze. "Stop pretending you're busy," she said, leaning just slightly closer so her voice brushed against my ear, soft and almost teasing. I blinked. My mouth opened, closed, opened again. I wanted to say something witty, something that would make her laugh, but all that came out was a low, strangled, She tilted her head, one eyebrow rising like she knew exactly what I was thinking, and maybe she did. She didn't press further. Instead, she let a small silence settle between us. It was charged in a way that made my chest tighten and my hands go numb on the notebook. I caught her glance flick down to the scuffed pages I'd been scribbling on, then back to me, and something in that little motion, a quiet acknowledgement, almost conspiratorial, made my stomach do that ridiculous flip I wasn't supposed to feel. The repair shop smelled faintly of motor oil and warm metal. A ceiling fan lazily stirred the air, but I could swear it had slowed just for us. I noticed the way she absent-mindedly touched the edge of the counter as if testing the temperature, her fingers brushing the worn wood, and something about that gesture, the patience, the subtle curiosity, made me want to reach across and touch it too. Not for any practical reason, not even to be bold, just to be near her. Her presence was magnetic, and I didn't know why. She watched me like she expected something from me, though I had no idea what that could be. Maybe it was the way she hummed softly under her breath while glancing over my shoulder at my homework, a sound almost too small to be noticed, but impossible not to feel. Or maybe it was the pause that followed, the one that stretched between words, stretched between heartbeats. I caught myself staring a little too long. Her lips twitched as if she'd noticed. And then, just like that, she leaned back, crossed one leg over the other, and sighed as if she'd done something monumental, like reminding me that I wasn't invincible, that someone could see through my walls without even trying. I tried to shake off the sudden awareness that my world had just narrowed to the space between us, but I couldn't. Every time she shifted, every small movement, I felt it like a ripple I couldn't dodge. And even as she finally stood, gathering her tools and murmuring something about checking inventory, I realized I was watching her leave, my pencil still poised uselessly above the notebook, utterly unable to focus. I didn't just want her attention. I didn't know how to name what I wanted, but I knew, somehow, that moment, that small smirk she left in her wake, would follow me for hours, and maybe longer, because the way she said, "Stop pretending you're busy," wasn't just a comment on my homework. It was a statement I couldn't stop turning over in my head, wondering what she really meant, and why it made my chest ache in a way I wasn't ready to understand. I found myself hovering by the counter again, tools in hand, though I wasn't exactly sure what I was fixing. She had asked me to help with the shelving in the back, nothing urgent, nothing impressive, but I followed her anyway, because the space between us felt electric even when she barely looked at me. She moved with that quiet confidence that seemed so effortless, and I realized I had been watching her hands. Long, precise fingers, slightly calloused at the tips, yet gentle when she touched the metal brackets. She caught me staring, or maybe she didn't, but she didn't comment. Instead, she hummed under her breath, a low, almost tired melody, and the sound made me ache in a way I couldn't name. "Careful," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "That edge is sharper than it looks." She didn't move closer to correct me, just hovered at a measured distance, letting me figure it out myself. And I did, though my hands shook slightly, not from the metal, but from the nearness of her presence. She paused mid-step, tilting her head to examine the top shelf. I noticed a slight furrow between her brows, a crease that deepened when she was tired or frustrated. I wanted to reach out, smooth it away, offer something, anything, but I didn't. I couldn't. I was still learning the rules of her world, of the space she let me occupy without invitation. "You're quiet today," she said suddenly, not looking at me directly. Just a statement, no question, but I felt it like a challenge. I'm focused," I muttered. She snorted softly, like she didn't believe me, and the sound made something twist in my chest. She leaned against the frame of the doorway, arms crossed, and for a brief second, her eyes softened, betraying a flicker of something vulnerable. Maybe fatigue, maybe disappointment, maybe something I wasn't supposed to see. Her laugh came suddenly, low and uneven, when I knocked a bracket slightly off balance. It wasn't full-bodied. It was more like a sigh that became sound. I watched the corners of her mouth twitch upward, the faint lines near her eyes deepening. And in that small, unguarded moment, I saw her human. Not untouchable, not perfect, just human. I wanted to ask if she needed a break, if she wanted someone to carry the heavier boxes, but my voice wouldn't come out right. So I stayed silent, letting her notice or not notice that I was paying attention to every tiny movement. The way her hair brushed her cheek, the subtle shift in her posture, the tired slump in her shoulders. When she finally straightened and took a step back to survey the shelves, our eyes met for a fraction longer than necessary. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the kind you get when you're standing on the edge of something dangerous, thrilling, and forbidden all at once. She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes fully, but enough to pull me in. I swallowed hard, and for a moment, everything else in the repair shop, the noise, the tools, the dim light, faded into the background. And then, just as quickly, she turned away again, leaving me staring at the empty space she had occupied, my hands still frozen over the bracket, wondering if I had just glimpsed something she would never let me fully touch. The rain had started just as I was about to leave, drumming against the tall windows of the repair shop. The sky was a low gray, heavy with the kind of storm that made everything smell metallic and alive. She was still there, leaning against the counter, her arms folded, watching me like she was weighing whether I was worth the effort of conversation. We were alone, at least we should have been. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional drip from the skylight were the only sounds. I moved closer under the pretense of adjusting a loose tool tray, but our shoulders brushed, just slightly, and the electricity in that tiny contact made my stomach knot. She didn't flinch. Instead, she exhaled slowly, eyes following my hands, then flicked toward mine and back again. I wanted to say something clever, something meaningful, but the words died in my throat. I could feel her watching me, as if she already knew the half-formed confession I was too scared to voice. "I thought you left already," she said finally, voice low, calm, but with an edge I couldn't place. I was waiting for the rain to ease," I murmured, aware of how small my answer sounded. I wanted to tell her I'd been waiting to see her again, but that would have been too much, too fast. She tilted her head, a little smirk playing at the corner of her lips, and I realized she understood. Not the exact thought in my head, but the intention behind it. A quiet acknowledgement that we were teetering on the edge of something neither of us was supposed to name. My phone buzzed in my pocket, an irrelevant group chat, but the timing shattered the spell. I pulled it out and noticed hers had lit up too. A name flashed briefly, someone from her past, someone I didn't know but could sense the history in the way her hand hesitated over the screen before she silenced it. I caught the flicker of tension in her jaw, the subtle stiffening in her posture. I wanted to step closer to bridge that distance, but I didn't. Instead, I adjusted the tool tray again, pretending it was important, all the while aware that my pulse was loud enough to drown out the storm. My fingers itched to brush hers, just a fleeting contact, but I held back. She shifted her weight, and our knees brushed this time. So light, so almost accidental, that I wanted to freeze time. She looked up at me, eyes meeting mine for a heartbeat that felt like minutes. I could see the hesitation there, the tiny confession that hovered on the edge of speech. I should probably check on something, she said, voice barely above the rain. And it was both an excuse and a retreat. I nodded, swallowing hard. Yeah, of course. She stepped back, and the distance returned, the invisible line we both refused to cross. But the memory of that near contact, the warmth of her presence, the tension in the small shared silence, it lingered, a quiet ache I couldn't shake. As the storm raged outside, I watched her move past the counter, her hair dampening slightly in the drizzle, and I realized I was still standing there, hands hovering over nothing, heart thudding with what almost happened, and what would have been impossible to stop once it started. I found her sitting at the small break table in the corner, the rain still hammering against the windows, condensation running in slow rivulets down the glass. I had been hovering near the doorway, pretending to straighten tools, pretending to be busy, but she didn't seem fooled. She didn't look up when I approached, just sat there, hands folded over a mug that steamed gently in the dim light. "Do you ever just stop pretending?" she asked finally, without looking at me. The words were soft, almost conversational, but the weight behind them pressed against my chest like a hand I couldn't shrug off. I swallowed, unsure if she meant me, herself, or both. "Stop pretending what?" She let out a quiet, humorless laugh, more of a sigh that morphed into sound. "That this little arrangement, like it's normal, like it's nothing." She finally looked up, and for the first time, I saw it fully. The exhaustion, the confusion, the tiny tremor in her gaze that no one else would notice. I didn't move closer. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed rooted, aware of every inch of space between us. The shop felt smaller somehow, the hum of machinery louder, and her presence impossibly heavy. "I don't know what we're doing," I admitted, my voice low. Too low, maybe. Too honest. It sounded like betrayal, but it wasn't, just the truth. She nodded slowly, lips pressed together, eyes tracking some invisible point on the far wall. "I don't either," she said. "I mean, you're so young and She trailed off, the pause louder than any word. She was trying to measure something. Her feelings, her limits, the impossible rules we were both tiptoeing around. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap with a gesture, a touch, anything, but I didn't. My hands itched, not for contact, but for a solution, a way to make sense of this tension that had been building since the first day she told me to stop pretending. We sat in silence after that, letting the storm fill the room. The light shifted, flickered across her face, and I noticed the slight tremble in her fingers as she wrapped them around the mug. The faintest frown appeared and disappeared, and I realized she was as vulnerable as I was. Maybe more. "I keep thinking, maybe I shouldn't be here," she said after a long pause. Her voice cracked slightly, not in weakness, but in the strain of being utterly honest. "But then, I don't know. I can't just walk away." I swallowed again. The words settled like bricks in my chest. I wanted to say something clever, something that would fix it, but nothing fit. All I could do was stare, trying to memorize the tiny micro-expressions that made her human. The slight hitch in her breath, the almost imperceptible tilt of her head, the quiet way she avoided meeting my eyes fully, though she never looked entirely away. The storm outside intensified, and with it, the ache between us. I felt a helpless pull, like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing a single step could change everything. She finally met my gaze, eyes glistening with unspoken truths. "I don't want to ruin anything," she whispered, barely audible, but the words struck me like a physical blow. "But I feel like I already have." And just like that, the silence we shared became louder than any conversation we could have had, leaving me standing frozen, heart hammering, completely unprepared for the truth she had just let slip. I had been sweeping the floor when I noticed her sitting on the edge of the workbench, her gaze fixed on something in her lap. At first, I thought it was another notebook or some scrap of paper, but as I stepped closer, I saw the corner of an old photograph peeking out. She didn't look up when I approached. "It's nothing," she murmured, tucking it back under her jacket. But the way her hands shook slightly betrayed her, subtle but impossible to ignore. "Want to show me?" I asked quietly, careful not to push. She hesitated, and then slowly pulled it out again. The photo was faded, edges curling, a small snapshot of someone I didn't know. A younger version of her, smiling with a man whose eyes held the same warmth she usually reserved for strangers, or maybe for me, only hidden. He died, she said softly, not as a statement, but as if saying it aloud might make it real again. Her voice cracked slightly, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. The shop felt colder somehow, though the afternoon sun had filtered lazily through the windows. I'm sorry, I whispered, unsure what else to say. My hand itched to brush over hers, to offer a comfort I wasn't sure she would accept. She shook her head gently. It's not your fault, she said, almost sharply, and then softer, almost to herself. I think about him too much sometimes. I sat on the stool across from her, careful not to crowd her, and tried to catch every detail. The slight downturn of her lips, the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers trembled as she traced the edge of the photograph. She looked vulnerable in a way that both scared and drew me in. I didn't know, I said, unsure if she wanted to hear it. I didn't know you carried him with you. Her laugh came then, small, bitter, and almost sad. Carried him? I guess. Or maybe he just lingers, like a shadow you can't step out of. She stared down at the photo, silence stretching between us, thick and almost unbearable. I thought I'd learned to let go, she whispered, barely audible. But sometimes, I catch myself talking to him in my head. Sometimes I even answer him, like he's still there. I wanted to say something profound, something that would untangle the ache in her chest, but I had no words. So I just sat there, letting her story sink in, feeling my own chest tighten. My eyes lingered on hers, on the fragile strength in them, on the way she was trying to be unshakable and failing in the most human way possible. She finally put the photograph away and stood slowly, like moving through water. Her movements were measured, but her gaze met mine, lingering longer than usual. There was a softness in it, a quiet admission that she had shared something no one else had heard in years. For a moment, I thought she might speak again, might say something that would tie her past to this tension between us. But she didn't. Instead, she simply leaned back against the counter, and the silence settled like a weight between us. Heavy, unspoken, and impossibly intimate. I realized then, with a strange thrill and a deep ache, that this moment, her letting me see the cracks she usually hid, had shifted everything. The air between us felt charged, fragile, and full of possibility. And just as I opened my mouth, unsure what to say, she turned her gaze toward the window, murmuring softly, almost to herself, I'm not sure I can stop remembering him, or what that means for me now. The words hung in the room like smoke, and I couldn't stop staring, heart hammering, feeling the quiet tremor she'd left behind inside me. I didn't speak as she moved to the window, letting the rain blur the world outside. I stayed by the counter, just watching the way her shoulders shifted, how the faint tension in her back softened the longer she stood there. There was a weight in the room that had nothing to do with the storm, and I realized it was the space we had been carving between us. Tight, fragile, impossible to ignore. You don't have to say anything, she murmured finally, not looking at me. I think we both know. I swallowed hard. I wanted to argue, to deny, to claim some rational distance, but I couldn't. Every instinct in me told me she was right. The truth wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was quiet, subtle, undeniable. We didn't need words to fill the spaces between us. The small glances, the tremor in her hands, the sigh that slipped from her lips, the way she lingered just at the edge of the counter. It all said more than I ever could. I stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, and she didn't move away. Not entirely. Just a fraction, enough to let me gauge the space between us, the air charged with possibility, but not desperation. My hand hovered for a heartbeat, then brushed hers lightly, almost accidentally. She didn't pull back. She didn't need to. The smallest contact, a fingertip against her knuckle, was enough to unravel all the careful restraint we had both been practicing. A quiet warmth spread through me, tethering me to the moment, to her. She turned slightly toward me, just enough that our arms brushed, our breaths mingling in the soft light of the shop. The storm outside became background noise. "Do you think this changes everything?" I asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. She tilted her head, eyes softened with the faintest trace of a smile, and for once, she didn't hedge, didn't retreat. "No," she said. "I think it makes what we've been pretending more honest. That's all." There was no declaration, no grand confession, just the acknowledgement of something that had been building quietly for months, woven into the way she laughed, the way she hesitated, the way I kept finding her in my thoughts long after I left the shop. I let my hand rest against hers now, fully, deliberately, the smallest pressure that spoke volumes. She shifted, leaning slightly against me, and I felt it. The shared understanding, the unspoken agreement, the quiet surrender to something neither of us had dared name aloud before. For a moment, everything felt still. The tools on the counters, the faint smell of motor oil, the hum of the fluorescent lights, they were all part of this small universe we had created together. Nothing else existed except that hand, that breath, that shared space. She leaned her forehead against my shoulder, and I felt her exhale, long and slow, releasing tension I hadn't even realized I had been holding. My chest eased, and for the first time in months, I felt like we were both exactly where we were supposed to be, without forcing it, without needing more. We didn't speak. Words weren't necessary. The silence itself became our conversation, measured, deliberate, full of unspoken trust. Outside, the rain continued to fall, persistent and steady. Inside, we stayed like that, hands intertwined, close enough to feel warmth, distant enough to still savor the fragility of the moment. And in that quiet, suspended space, I realized the truth. Nothing had to change in a dramatic way. The world outside could rage, shift, collapse, but here, now, together, was enough. Enough to finally stop pretending. I still remember the smell of rain on concrete that evening, the quiet hum of the shop, the way her hand had felt in mine. Light, tentative, and yet heavier than anything I'd ever carried. It wasn't a declaration of love, not in the grand, sweeping sense. It was something quieter, more enduring, acknowledgement, understanding, the kind of intimacy that doesn't need words to exist. Since that night, things have shifted in ways I didn't expect. I notice her more, not just her presence, but the little details I had missed before. The way her eyes soften when she's amused, the faint tension in her hands when she's tired, the tiny sigh she lets slip when something's too much. And she notices me too, in subtle ways. A glance, a slight lean toward me when we're shoulder to shoulder, a pause that lasts a heartbeat longer than necessary. I've changed too. I carry less hesitation now. Not recklessness, just a quiet confidence in knowing that connection isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's in the silences, the shared spaces, the small touches that don't need names. I learned that love, or whatever this is between us, isn't about fireworks or dramatic confessions. It's about presence, trust, and the courage to stay close even when everything outside wants to pull you apart. We don't speak of the past heartbreaks or lost opportunities anymore. They exist, sure. They're shadows in the corners, but they don't define the space between us. What defines it now is something softer, warmer. The way she tilts her head when she laughs. The way I catch her looking at me and think, finally, that maybe I belong here, in this quiet orbit she allows me to inhabit. Sometimes I catch myself smiling at nothing, and I realize it's her I'm thinking about. Not as a fantasy, not as a fleeting desire, but as someone real, flawed, human, and human enough to let me in. And I think that's what changed most of all. The way I feel, the way I see her, the way we both allowed something fragile and uncertain to grow without forcing it into a story it wasn't ready to be. The world outside the shop goes on as it always has, loud and relentless. But in the little bubble we carved together, there's quiet. There's presence. There's warmth. And sometimes, late at night, when the rain hits the windows and the lights hum softly above, I can still feel her hand brushing against mine, just barely, just enough. I've learned that the most important moments aren't shouted. They aren't posted or proclaimed. They're small, fleeting, human. And maybe that's the most beautiful kind of love there is. One that doesn't need to explode to exist. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?